Welcome to ADF TV. My name is Frank Nimphius and I'm from the Oracle JDevelop and ADF Product Management team. In this third recording that we do on security, I want to introduce ADF Security for you. And keep in mind that though ADF Security is not the only tool that you have in Oracle ADF to implement security, it's one of the key features that we implemented for you to apply data protection. On this slide you see that there is basically a four-tier protection that you have in Oracle ADF, starting from the view layer to the controller layer and binding layer, and then the business service, and last but not least the database tier. Now the responsibility that you find on the view layer as the first line of defense is that it triggers authentication, because that is where you first hit a protected resource. In addition, the view layer will enforce input validation. What's your first stop of enforcement for this? Remember the last recording where I talked about multi-line of defense, and you should implement it that way. The data binding layer and the controller layer can contribute to security as well. On the binding layer we do have ADF Security protecting ADF bound pages through the page definition file, and on the controller side we do have the task flow security, which allows you to protect your task flows against unauthorized access. The business service, and here I must admit we are much better integrated with ADF Business Component than, for instance, with EGB or Web Services, though you can protect the other two. We do have ADF Business Components integrated with ADF Security, and the reason why we can do this is because we own that framework. So ADF Business Component is a Java EE framework owned by Oracle, and for that reason we can do whatever we want. So we don't have to look at standardization processes just to get security implemented the way that we think it's best. So ADF Security is implemented or integrated with ADF Business Components, which means that you can enforce JARS-based policies on entities and entity attributes. On the database side, don't forget that the database has a very powerful security mechanism. I talked about in one of the other recordings about PL/SQL and the ability, for instance, to have stored procedures wrapping a table as an API so that you can enforce security through PL/SQL as an API. However, other options that you have would be to use, at least with Oracle, label security, or also called virtual private database, and proxy users. Now a proxy user is where you connect with an application to a really low privileged user account, and that user account will just pass the request to the more privileged account that you read the data from, so that from an external view the schema that would be configured as the data source is not the one holding the data. So think about this four-layer protection when you work with ADF Security. So when we look at the infrastructure that ADF Security works with, then there's a term I have to introduce, which is OPSS, the Oracle Platform Security Services, which is an evolution out of the JSON that we had in 10.1.3, just for those who are familiar with older releases of Oracle ADF. Now OPSS sits as an application, as a security protection layer on WebLogic server. And there it leverages the authentication services, the authorization services, and the credential provider services. OPSS is an API that ADF Security uses to check permissions for page flows and for pages. On this regard, ADF Security and ADF in general is a customer to OPSS, which means that we're delegating a lot of security work to OPSS and of course to the WebLogic server, as we will see on the next slide. Other customers of OPSS are the SOA suite or Web Center. So here we are definitely sharing the same piece of software enforcement, security enforcement I should have said. As you can see on this slide as well is that we use three different kinds of policy stores which we can optionally configure. The default is a file-based policy store. If you look at your WebLogic server deployment, you find a file called system.json.data.xml file. Now this is the file-based policy store. Another policy store will be LDAP if you configure OID to hold the permissions which are basically the policies, and there's an option to use an Oracle database for the same. And the policy store is where all the information about which user role is allowed, which permission, which is defined in the policy there. And that's what the policy store is. So let's have a look at how ADF security basically works. Now, authentication, and I mentioned before that we're delegating a lot of security related work to the container and to OPSS. Now, authentication is one of the examples. ADF security doesn't handle authentication, which has two benefits. The first benefit is that the ADF development team doesn't need to think about all the different ways of how to authenticate users. And the second benefit is you go into a proven environment, because WebLogic Server has a long history of good security built in, and we leverage the flexible architecture that the WebLogic Server has. And as we will see on a later slide, this also allows us to hook into several different authentication mechanisms, even chain them up without ADF having to do anything on this. So we delegate any authentication request to the WebLogic Server. The authorization, as I mentioned, we enforce on the bounded task flow and we enforce on pages. Now, bounded task flow, as soon as you enable ADF security, and if you look in JDeveloper, there is an application secure menu option, and the first option is to enable security and to define how you want to have it enforced. Just authentication, and authorization. Now, once we do this, automatically the framework will take care for checking permissions on any bounded task flow, and it will automatically check permissions on any page that sits in an unbounded task flow and is ADF bound. Based on this page definition file, we can tell that this is the case. For ADF business components, we protect using JARs entities, so you can have an update protection, so you want to make sure that not everyone can update a specific entity or delete an entity. And we also provide security, declarative security on attributes, which is mostly for update. And then all of the policies, and if you follow one of the tutorials or read one of the articles, you see that security really with ADF security mostly is declarative as far as it goes for the framework security. However, keep in mind that only because you can do stuff declaratively doesn't mean you cannot do it programmatically. And in many ways, programmatic security makes a lot of sense, and we'll cover this as well. A part of ADF security is an API. Now, everything is JARS-based, permission-based. Well, internally, the framework is just doing a check permission. However, you can do this as well. And for this, we provide expression language, and we provide a Java API. And all of these just starts from the security context. Now, the security context gives you access to the roles a user is in, and we're talking about enterprise roles, and we're talking about application roles. You can check if the user has access to a specific view, which we check for a region. That is what in security terms we call the view. And you can check for if the user has access to a specific task flow. And the view and the task flow are just referenced by their absolute name. So for the task flow that is starting from the webinf directory, the full document name and then the ID that will make up the task flow. However, we can also check for two types of permissions. You see at the bottom of this slide, first time the resource permission. Now, the resource permission is an OPSS specific permission that you can declaratively configure, for instance, to implement menu security. So I can create a resource permission just by going to the ADF Security editor, create a resource permission, call it menu security, and then for each of the menu items in this menu, I will create a permission. And then I can grant this permission, which means that if I use expression language on the UI component or wherever I want, I can hide, show, or just control the user ability to work with that menu item. If you already have JARS permission, which could be the case if you're in Java EE development for years, then you probably have an infrastructure for this, then you can even check against your own permissions. In this case, you will just provide us the name of the permission class, and then the same expression language in combination with OPSS will return true or false based on the user's ability to access. And then, of course, everything you can do in expression language, you can do with Java as well. So we provide Java APIs for this too. Programmatic security, well, I mentioned that the framework is doing a good job in protecting task flows and pages. However, you can extend the functionality. One of the functionalities, and I mentioned this with a menu security, because that's a more semantical security, it's not really something to be enforced by the framework. You can create resource permissions, and you do this declaratively, as I mentioned. Another option is that the ADF Security framework doesn't enforce authorization on views that are contained in bounded task flows. And the reason is because we delegate the authorization check to the bounded task flow level. So we assume that if a view is within the bounded task flow, then if the user is allowed to access the bounded task flow, the user is allowed to see the page and work with the page. If your use case is different in that you say, okay, now there's a specific page, then this page needs to have extra protection. One option to solve this would be to put this page into its own bounded task flow and use a task flow call activity to navigate to it. This way you can use declarative security, or the other option is just to create a view permission declaratively for that page that is in the bounded task flow. However, the framework itself will not enforce that security, but you can. You can use expression language, as I showed you on the previous slide, or you can use Java. So all that you need to do is to make sure that all the access paths that exist for this view that you want to have extra protection on is checked by you. And remember the design pattern that we talked about, checkpoint, so you can have specific checkpoints on navigating to a view that will ensure that in sensitive areas no one have entry who is not allowed to access this. And then we do have the ability on ADF Business Component side to use a technology that is called Groovy. There's often a requirement that users want to have a profile page, or you want to restrict data to be queried only for that authenticated user, and there should be no way around. Now the best way would be to keep the data where the data is in the database and not query it out. So what you can do is you can create a query predicate, and this predicate is also what we use with virtual private databases. So here you see an attempt for multi-layer of defenses. Virtual private database that uses a query predicate in the database using PL/SQL, and you can have the same on a view criteria, for instance, in ADF Business Components. And the way you would do this is you would create a view object, apply a view criteria that will filter the query by the authenticated user, and then you can use Groovy to fill the authenticated username into a bind variable, so that when you read the document, it will only show the information that are related to the user. At the end of this presentation, I do have a reference to a doc called Security for Everyone. You want to go there, there's a sample that comes with it, and look at that sample. It uses Groovy to protect a profile page so that you can only see your own data. So let's have a look at the design time. I talked a lot about declarative development, and indeed it is, and what we use for that is the JSON architecture, or the OPS architecture in JDeveloper. Now in JDeveloper you have a file which holds a policy which is called JSON data XML. When you enable security, what will happen is that we configure the web XML file with the triggering of authentication. Just in case that you have authentication only, we will edit the web XML file. If you choose the web XML file configuration for authentication and authorization, then you will find the configuration for authentication servlet in it as well. And this will also allow you to specify a welcome page and so on. So use web XML to set up security. However, it's not you're doing this declaratively. As soon as you enable security through one of the dialogues, that will automatically happen to you. And then what you see is that in JDeveloper you can specify users, enterprise groups, and application roles. Enterprise groups, by the way, is also what we refer to as enterprise roles, and this is part of an abstraction model that we're having. Now, a user typically is the grantee, so the one that should have permission to access a task flow or a page. However, you can imagine how difficult it would be in a multi-hundred or thousand user company to maintain security if permissions are granted per application to the user directly. So here abstraction comes in, and Java EE has the concept of a role. Remember, also part of the design pattern. So a role is an enterprise role on the first side, and the enterprise role is what comes out of the identity management system. So for instance, for Oracle, I'm an employee no matter which application I run. I'm not a manager because I'm not in a manager position. So I'm definitely in an employee role. Might be that in some of the application, I'm considered to be in an application development role. Again, something that could come from the identity management, and that would give me specific privileges, for instance, to be able to file bugs directly to the bug filing system. For the application itself, however, I'm not an employee and I'm not a development member. For the application, it will make up its own abstraction layer, and this is what we call an application role. And an application role will be used to grant permissions to make it easy to administer permissions for an application. And this application role later on then gets granted to an enterprise role, and this enterprise role of course has me as a member, and for that reason I could run the application with the permissions assigned to me. Sounds complex, but it's just for ease of administration, and I'm pretty sure that once you're getting into ADF Security, you will love that functionality. Now this is all configured at design time. When we run and test this, then the users, the groups and the application roles are deployed with the application to the integrated WebLogic server. And the integrated WebLogic server runs in development mode, which means it allows you to pass credentials on the fly. Now, when we look at the production system, it's looking similar, except for that now the users and the enterprise roles are coming from an identity management system. And I mentioned one of the benefits that we get out of OPSS is that now we can authenticate against different systems and different methods. For instance, we can authenticate against OID, we can authenticate against Active Directory, we can identify or authenticate against custom login modules or RDBMS. Now, nothing of these really needs to be coded in ADF. It's all part of WebLogic Server. So if you have WebLogic Server set up to authenticate against Active Directory, then ADF authenticates against Active Directory indirectly through OPSS. So we're leveraging an identity management system, and we are sure that at least for larger companies, you will have some sort of serious identity management system in place that you configure with the production servers. The production server by default, if it's WebLogic Server, doesn't allow you to deploy credentials with your application. And this is why you want to go to the application menu option and the application properties and remove the attempt to try and deploy credentials with your application. Because first of all, WebLogic Server in production mode wouldn't allow that, so there would be an error for this. And second, it doesn't make sense to deploy credentials with an application, because that would just harm security, because the worst thing that could happen is that you create a new account, a new database account on WebLogic Server that nobody knows about. So we protect you on the WebLogic side from this. So running WebLogic Server in production will not allow you to pass on credentials, create data sources. This is what we have Enterprise Manager for. As you can see on the right upper side, however, the whole relationship between application roles, permission and grants, it's exactly the same as in design time. And this is the whole idea here. You have a design time environment that mimics the runtime environment, so you can test applications and then you deploy them. When you deploy applications, what you basically can do is you can decide also to merge or just renew all the policies. So let's get to ADF security best practices. Well, the first is what I already said, always work with roles, because that greatly simplifies administration. You will also see there's a concept of entitlements in ADF security. It's not meant to be entitlement server. It's just the ability to grant a group of permissions under a name, which is the entitlement, to an application role. So even further simplifying administration. The recommendation for best practice is to keep application development separate from security administration. First of all, it requires a professional to really make sure that your deployment, your runtime environment at production is secure. So you want to put that into the hands of someone who knows what he or she is doing. And then we do have Enterprise Manager, which is a browser-based console that you can use, or actually the security expert will use, to create application roles in addition, or map application roles, or just change permissions. So that can basically, after deployment, change the whole permission infrastructure. So you want to do this. So never try to have all of the security infrastructure defined with the application. Though you have the application coming with the based permissions, but then in the end you want to hand it over to a security administrator using Enterprise Manager. When you use the ability I mentioned, that when new policies are deployed to the server, be very careful with to override or to merge policies. Always keep in mind that, of course, while you continue developing application, there will be some changes to permissions. However, you want to avoid to accidentally override permissions and then just cause some trouble with that. That would clearly go into this direction of misconfiguration. So you want to be careful there, but you have the option to decide when to deploy the application or redeploy the application, to keep the policies or to merge them or to override them with what you have in the application by then. So all permissions that we deploy to an application or that we use in an application are all under the top level application. Now what does that mean? If you watched ADF TV hopefully for all of the sessions that we did, then definitely you watched Chris Mears' Angels in Architecture, so the architecture pattern that he's presenting there. And you will see that a lot of the concept that we have is based on bounded task flows and architecting applications out of bounded task flow. And one of my sessions was about task flow oriented architecture, which goes into the same direction here. Now, if you think about that, and if you have a bounded task flow that you want to protect, then whoever builds the bounded task flow must have some idea about what should be protected there. Now, at the current state in Oracle JDeveloper, we don't have intelligence about what is the security requirement of a task flow. So that means that the developer who is assembling the application out of existing bounded task flows and ADF libraries would be responsible for knowing which permissions to grant where and which roles to associate with a bounded task flow. So here for you it's very important that every bounded task flow is well documented for its security needs. So don't forget that, because at the assembly stage this is where you enforce security and this is where the deployment then later will happen. So make sure that every region or every bounded task flow is secured on the application level that's assembling it, and that documentation guides the assembling developer. So that's it. ADF Security obviously is a solution. No. It's a tool, and I mentioned that right in the beginning. ADF Security is a tool. It's a very good tool. It's a very solid tool with a lot of declarative functionality there, and we make sure that our ADF Security platform just goes well with recommended security design patterns, and that really makes it possible to protect the view layer, the controller layer, ADF business components, and to pass the security context. I think that's quite a lot. Still, it's not all that you need to do and all that you need to know, and we'll cover that in the last recording, the fourth recording on security, where I will just give you a little bit out-of-the-box thinking of what else you can do. Now, one of the out-of-the-box thinking is, and again going back to the Angels in Architecture presentation, is to think about single sign-on. Now, do you have the requirement to perform multi-application authentication based on a single token or based on a single authentication? Well, remember that one of the OWASP top 10 security risks was the failure of authentication. And I know cases where people really tried to mimic single sign-on by having an authenticated user in one of their Java applications and then passing a token which will indicate to another application, hey, I'm a trusted authenticated user. But if the token is not secure, then the whole thing fails. Here again, like with many other software that is used by a lot of users, the rate of error and the rate of mistake is a lot lower with commercial software or software that is used by many users. And for that reason, I recommend that you go with an identity management system. In Oracle, we have Oracle Access Manager, and Oracle Access Manager will allow you with ADF to set up single sign-on. And there's a recording on the ADF Insider website that really steps you through all of that, what you have to do to make single sign-on working with Oracle Access Manager. So I'm not going into detail here. In our architecture pattern, single sign-on would be needed for the pillar architecture, as you can see here. The pillar architecture consists out of several Java EE applications, very close to what Oracle Apps is using, so Fusion Apps, and there are separate Java EE applications, and you authenticate users through single sign-on using Access Manager. Here's the landing pad for your follow-up reading. So Security for Everyone, as I mentioned, has a sample that you want to download. Have a look. It tries to be helpful with ADF Security, providing you some code hints so that you can have a look. There's a link to the ADF Insider recordings as well, so you can follow up with single sign-on. This concludes the third recording on application security. There's one left, so see you back.